Welcome back, class. We begin the last lecture set number 8 tonight. We'll be covering Chapter 15, Psychological Disorders, and Chapter 16, Therapy and Treatment. The topics will include such items as what are psychological disorders, perspectives on psychological disorders, anxiety disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorders, and others. We'll also review select topics from Chapter 16 on therapy, with an overview of the forms of therapy, numbers in therapy, past therapy techniques, the types of therapy and forms of therapy, and look at drug use and other cultural and religious beliefs that have an influence on therapy's success. So, what are psychological disorders? A psychological disorder is a condition characterized by abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. A psychopathology is the study of these psychological disorders, including their symptoms, etiology, their causes, and treatment. It can also refer to the manifestation of psychological disorders, psychopathology. How is it defined? Well, it's not just about atypical or unusual behavior. Plenty of folks can demonstrate unusual or atypical behavior, but not necessarily have a psychological disorder. We also will view the idea of how culture and norms will influence what exactly is considered to be psychological disorder or abnormal behavior. And then looking at the aspect of having some sort of harmful dysfunction as part of this disorder. So, how should we draw the line between normality and disorder? According to psychologists and psychiatrists, these disorders are marked by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's thinking, their emotions or how they feel, and their behavior. All right? So such thoughts, emotions, or behaviors are dysfunctional or maladaptive if they interfere with normal day-to-day life. And the dysfunctional person feels distressed. So one of the key aspects here is this. You may have some abnormal behavior, but it may not be seen as a disorder unless it begins to interfere with your normal day-to-day life. For example, you're not able to hold down a job, or all your relationships go bad because of your behavior or your thought processes or how you're unable to control your emotions. The dysfunctional person is often distressed. You can have everything going well in your life by way of work and by way of your life for the most part, but you, the person who has these thoughts or these feelings or emotional regulation problems or these behaviors, they feel distressed by these thoughts, feelings, and or behaviors. That's also rises to the level of a psychological disorder. So, the American Psychiatric Association, there are significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The disturbances reflect some kind of biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction. And the disturbances lead to significant distress or disability in one's life. The disturbances do not have to reflect expected or culturally approved responses to certain events. The idea here is that you can seemingly be normal from the outside of people looking at you, but these other things can be going on as well. That still would rise to the level of a psychological disorder. The diagnosing and classifying of psychological disorder is a major idea that has helped us tremendously over many decades. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, now in version 5, I believe, it's designed to help people to identify, based on symptomology, what types of disorders someone may be demonstrating. So the idea that we have symptoms, these symptoms have been classified into disorders. And with that, the DSM provides information about what the course of this disorder may be like, so people may know what they can expect if they have a particular disorder, and also what types of treatment have been found to be successful. So this graph shows the breakdown of psychological disorders comparing the percentage of prevalence among adult males and adult females in the United States. Some of the disorders we have here are major depressive disorder, alcohol abuse, specific phobias, social anxiety disorder, and so on. So the most common tool, again, is this DSM-5. currently, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, published by the APA. It describes disorders and estimates of their occurrence. Some idea is that DSM-5 changes can be updated from time to time. We have seen label changes from time to time, so they call it one thing, but then they call it something else a little bit later. They also add new categories. The previous version, DSM-5, the new category that added was hoarding disorder or binge eating disorder. And sometimes they'll have new or altered diagnosis. Sometimes it can be somewhat controversial. The notion is anytime you label somebody as having some sort of disorder, there's some baggage that potentially can come along with it. The idea is that when somebody has been diagnosed as having a disorder, there is a stigma usually associated with it. And we are aware and have some concerns about that happening when we do label people. So providing labels is done somewhat cautiously. So, do psychological disorders predict violent behavior? We always see this in TVs and movies, somebody who has been diagnosed as having, let's say, schizophrenia, and they have been involved in some sort of violent activity. But it should be noted that mental disorders seldom lead to violence, and clinical prediction of violence is unreliable. Most people with disorders are non-violent and are more likely to be the victims than the perpetrators of violence. When they are violent, moral and ethical questions about whether society should hold people with disorders responsible for their violent actions are definitely raised. It's one of the reasons why we have that insanity defense. You are going to be claiming that you're not guilty by reason of insanity, meaning that you are not in your right mind. Now, getting back to the idea of violence, triggers for violent acts by people with mental disorders, in addition to disordered thinking, include substance abuse. So normally what we'll see is when they do have violent tendencies, usually substance abuse is going to be in the picture. Now, I want to bring up this idea, this thing called comorbidity. The DSM-5 also provides information about comorbidity, the co-occurrence of two disorders. So what it comes down to is this. If someone has a psychological disorder, there is a possibility they may have also an additional psychological disorder on top of that. For example, the DSM-5 mentions that 41% of the people with obsessive compulsive disorder also meet the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. So we have the situation here where what may lead to treating major depressive disorder may be counterproductive when it comes to treating OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. With this Venn diagram, we see this crossover is about 41% have comorbidity. So obsessive compulsive disorder and major depressive disorder frequently occur in the same person. Now, looking at perspectives on psychological disorder. For centuries, psychological disorders were viewed from a supernatural perspective, attributed to a force beyond scientific understanding. Those afflicted were thought to be practitioners of black magic or possessed by evil spirits. And this went on for some time. It also sort of suggested and led to harsh treatment of individuals who were, we would define them today, describe them as having a psychological disorder, but they may have been treated very harshly because they were thought to have been possessed by evil spirits or practicing in some sort of form of black magic. So that went on for some time, and the treatment of people who had psychological disorders were horrendous. They were not treated well at all. But eventually we did see a change in perspective, with some people saying they need to be treated more humanely. But one of the major things that changed was how we look to understand psychological disorders. The medical model. By the 1800s, the search began for physical causes of mental disorders and for curative treatments. With the medical model of mental disorders, mental illness is to be diagnosed on the basis of symptoms and treated through therapy, often in a psychiatric hospital. This was a reinvigorating of the medical model has come to in recent research in genetically influenced brain abnormalities in brain structures in biochemistry, as we look more deeply as to a reason to explain why people have psychological disorders. So we look at the biological perspectives of these disorders. A person's risk of developing schizophrenia, for example, increases if a relative has schizophrenia. The closer the genetic relationship, the higher the risk. So what we see here is that if you have an identical twin and you share 100% of the genes, there is a good chance that that other twin will develop schizophrenia, for example. But as we get further and further away, genetically dissimilar, we see that it becomes less problematic with regard to revealing yourself as having a particular disorder such as schizophrenia here. The key idea is that yes, genetics seems to play a role in schizophrenia as well as other disorders when it comes to someone demonstrating signs that they have a particular type of disorder. The diathesis stress model of psychological disorders, what this is coming down to, it integrates biological and psychosocial factors to predict the likelihood of a disorder. This model suggests that people with an underlying predisposition of a disorder are more likely than others to develop a disorder when faced with adverse environmental or psychological events. So the idea, we have two individuals that may have very similar genes, so to speak, but one develops a disorder and one does not. The idea is that the adverse environmental or psychological events that may have occurred in one individual's life may make it more likely that they develop the disorder as opposed to the other individual who did not have those adverse environmental or psychological events in their life. So the predisposition is there, but you have to have another factor, an outside factor, that will increase the likelihood of you developing a particular disorder. Now, let's look at some of these disorders. You generally know, and most people have some idea of what disorders are and some of the categories of these disorders. So now let's look at some of the anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders include such things as OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So how do generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and phobia differ? First, anxiety disorders are marked by distressing, persistent anxiety or maladaptive behaviors that reduce the anxiety. They include such things as generalized anxiety disorder, where the person is just tense and uneasy all the time, continually. Panic disorder, where the person experiences extraordinary panic attacks, sudden episodes of intense dread and fear. They're very unpredictable. And then we have phobias. A person has intensely and irrational afraid of a specific object, activity, or situation. So anxiety disorders, there are a whole variety of these. We have, for example, specific phobias. Acquisition of phobias can be done through learning, through classical conditioning, where you have been conditioned to fear something. We have a list of some phobias here. Arachnophobia, fear of spiders, asterophobia, fear of thunder, and so on. So there are so many phobias out there that people may have an irrational, intense fear of, well beyond what it normally would be felt. There's some fear, but this is an irrational fear, an extraordinary fear about an activity, a situation, or a particular object that the person is experiencing. Now the key thing is phobias are somewhat common, more common than some of the other disorders, but normally we can, if we're lucky, have a phobia but not go seek therapy for a particular phobia that we may have, because there are many times where we can just make sure that we avoid the thing that we are phobic about. So a phobia is an anxiety disorder marked by this persistent irrational fear of that object or activity or situation. We have specific phobias, as we saw earlier, particular animals, insects, and heights. We also have social anxiety disorder, formerly called social phobia, an intense fear of other people's negative judgments. And we all do experience this to some degree. People with this disorder avoid social situations, speaking up in public, going out, going to parties, and if unable to avoid them, may experience strong symptoms of their anxiety. So, social anxiety disorder, we see characterized by this extreme persistent fear or anxiety and avoidance of social situations. Safety behaviors, mental or behavioral acts that reduce the anxiety in social situations by reducing the chance of negative social outcomes, avoiding eye contact, rehearsing sentences before speaking and so on, talking only briefly, and not talking about oneself to bring attention onto you. We're avoiding all that social anxiety by doing these things to try to perform ourselves in sort of a safety net. Panic disorder, an anxiety disorder marked by this unpredictable minute-long episode of intense dread which persons experiences terror and accompanying chest pain and choking. Sometimes can feel like one is having a heart attack. There are sudden episodes with intense dread. And a couple of things. We have the physical symptoms that do occur with it, which can sometimes be confused with having a heart attack. One of the other key factors with panic attacks is this. Because they're so unpredictable, one of the key issues that really grind people that have this is that they're always worried about them experiencing another panic attack, which increases the dread factor. So you're going on a job interview. You had a panic attack a few weeks ago. You're going on a very important job interview. You will be concerned and worried about, oh my God, what if I have a panic attack during the interview, which heightens your anxiety even to a larger degree. And we have agoraphobia, a fear or avoidance of public situations from which escape may be difficult should a panic attack occur. You're so afraid of having the panic attack that you want to avoid public situations which make it less likely for you to easily escape if you had a panic attack. So, panic disorder. People with panic disorder experience recurrent, more than one, and unexpected panic attacks along with at least 1 month of persistent concern about additional panic attacks. A panic attack is defined as a period of extreme fear or discomfort that develops abruptly and reaches a peak within 10 minutes. And there are many physical manifestations of the panic attack which we've mentioned previously. We have feeling dizzy, shortness of breath, chest pains and palpitations of the heart, nausea or abdominal distress. Now, generalized anxiety disorder is a relatively continuous state of excessive, uncontrollable, and pointless worry and apprehension. There is not one specific thing that you are concerned about. It's just a generalized feeling of dread. It's just there all the time, sort of hanging over you. So the person with this continual tense, apprehensive feeling, the state of the autonomic nervous system is aroused here. Worry continually or often jittery, on edge, and sleep deprived. It leads to a lack of concentration. This free-floating anxiety is not linked to any specific type of stressor. It often is seen with depression. You're always on stress. You're always sort of like on red alert, and it can be very, very debilitating. It may lead to other physical problems like high blood pressure, the stress. And as we know, when you are stressed for long periods of time, your immune system is going to be damaged and you're more likely to catch such things as colds. And then we have the OCD, another one that most people are very familiar with. People with OCD experience thoughts and urges that are intrusive and unwanted and are the need to engage in repetitive behaviors or mental acts. So we have this notion of obsessions. You continually think about something. For example, let's say you continually think about germs and dirt and filth. That is your obsession. But then, in order to relieve this feelings that comes about because of the obsession, you are compelled to perform certain acts. For example, washing hands. We do have a little bit of this OCD type of thing often. For example, people who may check the doors and locks at night when they go to bed. They get up in the middle of the night, they check the doors again. So we do have some tendencies for these types of behaviors. But obviously when someone's having a serious issue with this type of disorder, OCD, we're talking about someone washing their hands, let's say 100, 200 times a day, or checking things over and over again 15, 20 times. The idea is that they become well out of control and begin to interfere with one's day-to-day life, and or also cause the person who's experiencing this some degree of distress. We have body dysmorphic disorder, hoarding disorder. Body dysmorphic disorder is preoccupied with perceived flaw in the physical appearance. People with hoarding disorder cannot bear to part with personal possessions, regardless of how valueless or useless these possessions are. This is something that's come to be a lot more common in today's speech and knowledge of this, because we even see television shows that demonstrate individuals who suffer from these types of disorders. And then we have mood disorders. They're characterized by severe disturbances in mood and emotions, most often depression, but we also have mania and elation. These are characterized by massive disruptions in mood. They can range from extreme sadness and hopelessness to extreme elation and irritability of mania, where you are just so happy and pleased with yourself that it is impossible to believe that you will ever be depressed again in your life. So we see the mood disorders are something that is somewhat common too, that we see as very body. The bipolar disorder, commonly known or previously known as manic depression, often exercises or experiences mood states that vacillate between depression and mania. That is, a person's mood is said to alternate from one emotional extreme to the other. A manic episode is characterized by a distinct period of abnormally persistent, elevated, expansive, irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased activity or energy lasting for about a week. So they're on the top of their game. Things look wonderful. They think they can do nothing wrong during these manic episodes that last about a week. But eventually the episode will go away and you'll go down to the depths of depression. So when it comes to this, we see women's risk of major depressive disorder is nearly double that of men. Women experience depression 1.7 times more often than men do. Women's diagnoses are generally more internal. Men's disorders are more external. Internal, you have depression, anxiety, inhibited sexual desire. For men, we see it more externally focused, alcohol use disorder, antisocial conduct, and a lack of impulse control. Most major depressive episodes end on their own. Therapy often helps, but it tends to speed recovery. But even without it, most people will recover. Recovery is more likely if first episode strikes later in life, there were few previous episodes, and there is minimal stress and a strong social support system. Now, understanding major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, the social cognitive perspective. Negative thoughts and negative moods interact. We have this idea of learned helplessness that may exist with self-defeating beliefs, self-focused rumination, just going over and over and over again, self-blaming, and a pessimistic explanatory style. When something happens, good or bad, we have to explain it. We have to attribute the cause to that. And sometimes we can have a very pessimistic view of the causes, the way we explain what happens in our life. This is found more often in women than men, who may tend to respond more strongly to stress. This rumination is this compulsive fretting and overthinking about our problems and their causes. It can divert us from thinking about other life tasks and increase our negative moods. Critics note that a chicken and egg problem in social cognitive explanation of depression, which comes first, the pessimistic explanatory style or the depressed mood. The basic premise is this: when something happens, how we explain it matters. And this explanation can cause us to be very negative and bring us down, which then causes issues. Then we do the same thing again. It goes in sort of a cycle. So depression's vicious cycle, we have the following. Stressful events are interpreted through a brooding, negative explanatory style that creates a hopeless, depressed state that hampers the way the person thinks and acts. These thoughts and actions in turn fuel stressful events that are interpreted through the brooding negative explanatory style. So it goes around and around in a cycle. So we have the stressful events, the negative explanatory style, the depressed mood, and then the cognitive and behavioral changes, which then again in turn can lead to more stressful experiences. We'll stop there for now.